This is part of what's turned into an ongoing conversation that's also happening on multiple fronts. There's an interesting thread now on Yammer that Gary Briggs created about basically ChatGPT use cases. So let me set up the discussion, and then hopefully this will be a discussion, because the goal is I have a couple of meta goals. I'm supposed to talk to some of the school staff about ChatGPT thoughts, draft guidelines, and then I'm on a panel for the Public Interest Technology University Network later this month, where that will be the topic. So we did some preliminary stuff and had some conversations back in January, February, but this stuff is moving so quickly that I figure getting more input is not a bad thing. So let me let's see. Oh no, not that one. Let me do a share. No, I don't want to update the driver. Pick a window here. Here we go. All right, so hopefully folks can see the deck here. So this is not an exhaustive. It's a little bit of a revisit, but then also a reframing so we can have a conversation. So I think for those of you who haven't seen High and Low, it's a Kurosawa film. Actually, the actual translation from the Japanese title is Heaven and Hell, but for some reason, when they did the marketing for the US market, they, I guess, didn't want to call it Heaven and Hell, so they called it High and Low. Great movie. So is this a match made in heaven, or is it worse? And then, which we'll talk about in a minute, there's this question about cheating, and it came up in a Boston article about Boston University. I did a Google search for movies on cheaters, and this is what came up. I cannot necessarily recommend this one because I haven't seen it, and not clear that this is going to live up to the high bar set by Kurosawa. So I kind of doubt it. But let me just start with two different universities. And Hamad had sent around an email on a Boston Globe article, and so I pulled out a little bit of that article, and I think what this got down to, because it was really focused on a computer programming class and ethics, and to me, the most interesting question that came out of it is, what is cheating? Schools have historically fought cheating. Cheating has taken a number of different forms, but I think the ante has been upped now, and so we probably have to have some fundamental revisitation of what constitutes cheating and plagiarism. And then the second one is, I don't know that this is for public consumption, because I got this from my wife, who's faculty at Cal Arts, but this is what Cal Arts sent around to their faculty, and the language that they focused on was academic integrity, and it's just different language for cheating. You could make the argument. They're leaving it up to the instructors to determine how the tools are used. And what's interesting is, for an art school, the generative AI around images like Midjourney and DALL-E become much richer area for discussion, along with ChatGPT. The one thing I did think was interesting was that the CIO, the and the provost office got together and gave them draft language for use in the syllabi, and they gave them two different ones. So one was if the faculty decided that ChatGPT was going to be prohibited, and then or generative AI was going to be prohibited because they call out Dolly because they know that image generation is going to be an issue at an art school. And then the second option was use only with prior permission. What's interesting is they didn't give the third, which is use it however the heck you want. Presumably, their thoughts are that students using generative AI and without citing it is a violation of academic integrity. But that may be actually another discussion to have. The other thing is that they have implemented copy leaks, which is AI detection software on their learning management system. I have serious doubts about any of the AI detection software, and I'm of the mind that false positives are probably the worst thing you can do in an academic institution. But that's their approach that they've done. And then just to remind folks, back in January, we took a Tech and Narrative Lab residency class session, and myself and a couple students did a very quick and dirty task analysis looking at Party Rand students, what the various things that they do in order to get into the program, what they do during the program, and then what they do to get out of the program, and what they do in the workplace. And this is not an exhaustive or highly rigorous analysis, but we thought that it was interesting. So, and it's the product of literally a couple of hours on the fly coming up with things. But if we look at the scorecard, there's not a lot of things that generative AI doesn't have some degree of utility for. So that means that we probably need to wrap our heads around what guidance is going to look like and how we're going to deal with this. So this was the draft, or this is some of our overarching questions, and kind of broke things down into what, how, why, which those who have taken Tech and Society will recognize that. I do eat my own dog food. Thinking about the what, how, why for this, and you think about educational tasks, or even some work tasks, there's the generative AI seems pretty good at doing what and how, and maybe not so good with the why side of things and the sort of deep contextual analysis. That said, I have a caveat to that. So these are some things that we distilled out of what we want to think about. But then Tuesday in Tech and Society, we the first meeting of Tech and Society, one of the things that we end up doing is watching a short video by Keiichi Matsuda called Hyper Reality. For those who haven't seen it, I highly recommend that you look at it. It's about 10 years old now, but it basically is a world build. It's a future fiction, and it lays out a world which is highly driven by augmented reality and data floating everywhere. And it poses some very interesting questions, but it presents a lot to react to. And that's the way that we actually use it in Tech and Society, is it provides a vision, and then it's something that you can react to. And what we end up doing is everyone tries to figure out, what are the good things that you saw, what are the bad things that you saw. And this year we also extended that to say, where's government regulation, or where is it missing in this? And so we did that exercise in real time. But I decided, well, I should probably ask ChatGPT what they think about this. And I was not sure that the model would know about a I mean, what, I think it's 6 million views, but this is not, I mean, relatively obscure. So I asked ChatGPT what are the bad things, and it knew. What's interesting is it knew about the video, and it actually had some analysis of it. The thing that I thought was really interesting is when it was asked the bad things, it started its answer with a caveat that I'm a language model. I don't have personal opinions. I can provide information on potential criticism or concerns. And then it goes on to list 5 different areas. It talks about issues around privacy, escapism, commercialization, and equity ethics. It does a paragraph on each one, and actually talked about a lot of the things that the students ended up identifying and we ended up discussing in class. Then when I asked it the good things in hyperreality, it said it's a short film, blah, 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 presents a dystopian feature, did not include the caveat when it's talking about the good. And then goes on to mention the things that presumably others have written about because it's ingested other things that others have said. I'm assuming that it didn't watch the film and then figure it out on its own. And then the third one was what aspects of government regulation, and again, are present or lacking. And again, no caveat up front saying that I don't have personal opinions, but in this case said there's no explicit depictions of government regulation, but did infer issues around privacy and data, safety, security, ethical use, abuse. So the whole why and existential, we can argue about whether or not this qualifies as getting towards that, but I'd say it's at least flirting with aspects of that. And then this was the draft policy that we came up with end of January about not banning it, encouraging the use, be very particular about citation of when it gets used and how it was implemented. Maybe the citation, we come up with a citation standard that includes the prompt. Not quite sure. But then there are these deeper questions that we think get broached about, is this very akin to the calculator and the impact that the calculator had on what math was taught and how math was taught? Is it analogous to spell check? Is it orders of magnitude beyond that? And then the last question, which I'll just tee up what I think will be another conclave, is what about IP? Because this may be the Achilles heel for this, at least from a commercial standpoint in the short term. And I just pulled up, there was articles that went viral yesterday about P. Diddy saying he has to pay Sting $5,000 a day because he sampled a song and didn't license. And so there was a big push in the early aughts around the concept of remix, and Creative Commons was created to try and support the idea of people putting their content out there so others can remix it. And in some ways, I think these large language models are kind of like sampling, remix, and derivative work totally on steroids. So with that, I will cede the floor and say, okay, what do we what's the guidance in the educational sector and what's the guidance in the research sector that makes the most sense?
I'll jump in. I just oh, Carter, were you going to say something? You go first. I'll follow you.
So I remember when I first started teaching and running into a student just blatantly copying somebody else's homework before class. Didn't realize that I was teaching that class. And he was telling me how he just had to get this done. And I said, well, aren't you cheating? And he said, well, yeah, but I mean, everybody cheats. It was just so I didn't know what to say to him. It was so shocking. And so that there have been different tools for cheating for a long time, and this is all in the context of engineering, where a lot of the homework is calculations and equations. And this I view as yet another tool, albeit a powerful one. But I think of cheating, first of all, as taking something you didn't do, so assuming zero thought into it and claiming it as your own. So there's a moral aspect that says, okay, morally that's not right. But then in terms of teaching, at least in engineering, one of the goals is to facilitate problem solving in some capacity, and assuming the problem is not just to get your homework done, then ChatGPT can counter that. So that's how I think of cheating. Ultimately, though, it falls on to the teacher or the professor. If you want to teach problem solving, and ChatGPT is a tool for cheating, just as copying and then iPhones were, et cetera, et cetera. It's almost incumbent upon the professor to be creative about assignments and teaching techniques to achieve that goal of teaching problem solving. Initial thoughts, I don't know that they're certainly not well articulated, but I don't know. It's my knee-jerk reaction.
I think I kind of agree with what Tim said. I think what I'd add to it is that I do think getting folks to provide the prompt and the response as their citation, just because it is, kind of stochastic responses in terms of there is, you're not exactly sure what they're getting and what they added. I also like, as far as teaching goes, I kind of think it using it to establish a baseline. Like your answer must be at least this good to get to get a passing grade in the class. And then also it does encourage structuring questions, the types of questions that ChatGPT and those things don't answer well right now. And so it kind of, it does put the onus on the professor to think about how to structure questions like that. And then, of course, like GPT-5 comes out and you have to redo it each year. But I don't know if, and I think that's kind of the game we'll be playing for a while. Also note on the QA side, I don't think we have guidance yet for how that'll affect research. But I kind of think, along the same lines, having depending on how it's used, if it's used for like helping you write the code or something like that, I don't think that needs to be cited. Just like you wouldn't cite, Stack Overflow or something like that when you were debugging your code. But I do think if you're having it write portions of your report or something like that, then you would probably want to say like written portions of this were written with ChatGPT or something like that, or maybe even flag the chapters. I'm not actually, that's something I'd be interested in hearing other people's thoughts on. Over.
So the problem with that is if ChatGPT writes something, a reference, a report, you need to get the references that ChatGPT used. You can't, you've got to flow through to where the information comes from. And that sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. You can ask ChatGPT for references. Sometimes it comes up with it, sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah, I think that's the challenge with derivative work, and that's why I brought up sampling and remix. So when when a musician samples something, it's pretty obvious where that came from. When you do remix, oftentimes you're manipulating the original source so much that it's obfuscated, and it's kind of like, ChatGPT has used such a huge volume of original material or stuff that it was trained on, that I don't know that you can draw a line back. That's the core problem. Keller.
Yeah, so I think I'm perhaps approaching this from a bit of a different framework. And so my basic pitch is that it's worth starting from the question of, like, what will be the long run use of these models? And what will the impact be? And then walking backwards from there to say, okay, how should we be teaching use? So I recently used some like edited ChatGPT output for a side contract that I was doing. Someone said, hey, can you do this thing? And I was like, yeah, sure. And then there was one thing I was like, I don't want to think up through like all of the implications of this particular idea. Hey, Claude, would you run through like everything on this? And I got my outputs and it was nice. And I like looked at it and I edited it and like, corrected it for grammar, corrected it for professionalism, made sure that like I agreed with everything that was being said, and pasted it into the document. And that to me is entirely ethical because I stand by every word I've said. And that's a part of it, that you are only allowed to blame ChatGPT if you have properly cited and said this came from ChatGPT. But if you are using it as a text generation tool or an idea generation tool that you're going to look at and think about, then I don't see it as something that is going to be. I expect that is going to be fine in long run normal practice for policy analysts. And that's the standard that I'm using for education, that we should be, if we're training people to be good policy analysts, we should think, how will people be doing policy analysis today, 5 and 20 years down the line? I think that what I've described is sort of not explicitly giving prompts, but yeah, if you want to use that, fine, in the same way. And yeah.
It sounded like you mentioned, and I might have missed this, two subtly different things: idea generation and text generation. And I would argue, perhaps morally, as well as in the context of teaching somebody to problem solve or generate new ideas, the text generation would be okay, but idea generation might not. For example, if I were to, and I know this is extreme, read Einstein's theory of relativity and say, yep, I agree with that, makes sense to me, I wouldn't necessarily be justified in, signing my name to that or including that without a reference to Einstein. And so it could be argued that that would be morally wrong, and that I had not exercised my ability to come up with ideas as complex as the theory of relativity. So I don't know. There's a distinction between idea generation and text generation. Over.
So go ahead, Keller. I was gonna throw a semantic concern out there.
I think it's an interesting distinction to make between idea and text generation. And I think there's definitely, in a lot of ways, a stronger educational case for restricting idea generation. I'm very sympathetic to that. The use of ChatGPT to turn sentences into paragraphs, to take a bulleted list and produce a multi-paragraph document, to me, I think that's just straightforwardly, that's a thing that people can now do. That's a useful writing tool. To the extent that you're like, oh no, we need to teach writing, why, if we have this, if you're, I mean, I think that there's a reasonable case that like it might still make sense for, you know, elementary, middle, and high school that, okay, no, you're trying to teach foundations here in some important way, but we're adults, we're professionals, we're working on this. If we want to use a tool to help us write more effectively, I see that case as much more akin to the spell check. I think idea generation, the other framework that I have is that to me, this is an incredibly useful and powerful set of skills and tools. And learning those is and should be something that we promote and encourage and is very valuable for students to pick up. So I am perhaps more inclined to support the use of LLMs for this than I would be otherwise, because I think that if you're using LLMs, you are learning something that I expect will be incredibly important. And the counter argument there is that like these are changing fast enough that it's not actually long-term value to understanding how they work today. But I'm not convinced of that.
So Keller, it's an interesting point, and it's one that that we had broached in our preliminary guidance, and the language that I use around it is mechanical versus conceptual. And you could make the argument that the reason that we teach students to write, that is a largely mechanical process, but we need to give students language tools, and then some of the critical thinking gets baked into the writing process such that then they can work on conceptual things. And the analogy for the policy space is around calculus. Right? Calculus ends up getting used in a lot of ways, but the act of solving a calculus problem, ChatGPT can do that. So then it's kind of begs the question, do you need to learn to do calculus in order to understand how it applies in modeling and in other places? And I think I don't know that we have good answers to either of those questions.
You know, as sort of an addition to that, if I understood what you said, Todd, if you think about writing, I don't know that it's just purely mechanical. Maybe you didn't say mechanical, but there's an aspect of it that involves organizing your thoughts. So if you can range from a clause or a sentence all the way to a 100-page RAND report, and especially in the latter, it really requires some thought about how do I want to organize this? What's the order, and what's the story I want to tell to communicate the idea? That's a pretty important skill to have, that you would want to try to teach and not accept somebody who borrows that from something else or someone else, I think. No?
Well, so I would say yes, but if you think back to learning English in elementary school and junior high and even into high school, there's a lot of mechanical processes going on, right? You're learning how to diagram a sentence, you learn verb subject agreement, you learn conjugation, right? Those are largely mechanical things, but they go into this they're the mechanical part of presenting the ideas. And so I agree that organization of your ideas is a big part of what writing is, but I could imagine a large language model where I spit a bunch of clauses that are my ideas into it, and what it spits out is really really eloquent prose. And so then if that's the case, then as a content creator and an author, then all I'm worried about is coming up with the ideas and how the ideas fit together. And I'm not really worried about generating coherent prose. Carter, I think your hand was up next.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that strikes me is there's a sequencing thing here going on where, like, right now today, we can't trust these tools much. We can trust them for small things like editing or something like that, maybe. Even there, it's not clear. And probably for at least the next 5 years, we won't have confidence that they're behaving properly, for these kinds of tasks. And so we need to be critical consumers. We need to, like, there's a certain skill set that will absolutely be vital for the next 5 years, and then it may have like diminishing returns, but it's not obvious which path we're going down and whether or not just having larger and larger language models is going to get us there, or whether we'll need new sort of technologies. And so it does seem like there's a lot of utility in learning these skills for the short term, and it's just we don't know yet what will be useful for the long term. I don't know if folks agree with that or be interested in hearing responses.
Mo.
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts. I'm using Chat GPT, and so two things on that. One is when I write something, basically I do the thinking process, and then I actually, after like writing the first draft, then I put it in Chat GPT and say, okay, find flaws in this one. Yeah, like a prompt like that. Evaluate this one critically for me. And sometimes it does a good job, honestly. But even I ask, like, graded, like you're a polymath, think that you're a polymath and you know every domain of science. So look at that and tell me what are the weakness of this proposal or writing. And it does a well job most of the time, I would say. And catching things that I haven't seen before. I mean, like you in a way, it's good for us to. I remember that I wrote a proposal, and in that proposal, I missed to add something on equity and on fairness. And then I throw it at Chat GPT, and it's told me, oh, you need to write something probably about this one as well. And I said, oh yeah, that's a good idea actually. So you see things like that. And it's helpful. Like in addition, sometimes we talk too much about being biased. It can help us to catch those biases that we have. Is that sometimes I've seen that in a couple of times, which is quite interesting.
So Delani, do you want to make your point? Because I think it's an important one, and actually I'm curious to hear more about your experiment that you did with not having to read papers.
Yeah, I mean, it really, my broader point was that we're having a discussion about what Chat GPT can do, and that's just one tool with a certain amount of ability, I guess, is what I'm saying. And there's a number of others out there. If you take, any of Sydney by Bing or Bard by Google, those are tied to their search engines. So you can ask questions and get some. I don't know that it's doing a lot of narrative response, but you've got some sources in using those tools. And then I was using a tool that I've been impressed with. Someone built it. I think it's using, you can design it to do a number of things, but I think it's using GPT-3 under the hood. And it's using GPT-3 to do the interpretation of what a paper might contain in it. And then so you ask a narrative question, you've already loaded those papers, it knows what's in them, it pulls the relevant sources, pulls the relevant chunks, reformulates them so that it can answer your question using its own narrative abilities and spits it back. That exists now, and it's only going to get better. And so that's the kind of thing that I was really just not wanting people to get stuck on, well, ChatGPT has these limitations, because there's a bunch of other tools coming quickly that don't have those limitations.
In fact, we're well on the way to having a RAND specific one of those that goes through we've only got some of the RAND corpus now, but we soon will, I think we'll have the whole thing. And we've got it all chopped up and stuffed into a database. And you ask a question, it finds all the most relevant stuff, summarizes it, and then writes up a summary with citations to actual RAND reports. And it's actually doing pretty decent literature reviews at this point.
Tim, it's the exact same thing that I'm.
Yeah, we took off of that. I think it's part of the paper QA is what you're talking about.
Papers QA is
that's where we
the
started.
Library that's right. That's built up. Yeah, I know we're using the same thing. I was using a version that I have on Hugging Face. I think Liang took. He rebuilt a version internal on a RAND server, or at least on Amazon or something. But yeah, same idea.
And it's actually crazy how well it works once you feed it enough data. It's producing really better lit reviews than I would expect from a student who isn't a specialist in the area, for instance, and of course more thorough. It doesn't miss stuff.
So
Yeah,
I'm sorry. So you're saying this does automated annotated bibliographies?
It writes a narrative. Here's what RAND has said on this topic, and then it gives you several paragraphs saying that this is the case, and here's the citation, and this is the case, and this is the citation.
But if you give it you can give it a dozen papers, and it will summarize each of them in a reasonable manner.
Yeah, well, we've given it 1,000 papers so far, and we soon will have. We're trying to get a clean digital copy of everything RAND has ever written, but we should be able to have it do a fairly complete review of everything RAND has ever said on a given topic.
Now, where I'm going,
they got 10,000 papers, say.
Now, where I'm going is one of the products. So I'm at Livermore. One of the projects that our fellows, including RAND fellows who come to visit us, or interns do, is prepare annotated bibliographies before a workshop. So we'll give it, they'll do a little bit of research, and that's very useful to the workshop participants. But sounds like there's a better way to do that. We got to give the interns something else to do.
Yeah, I mean, our limitation right now is that we're only reviewing. We have a finite, high quality body of literature to cite RAND stuff. It doesn't, and the version that Dulani's been working with, you give it an arbitrary bucket of stuff, a bunch of papers that you want to fish in, and it will fish in them. Evolving exactly what you feed into it, what it's going to search over, remains an interesting question.
Sure, interesting.
So I'm wondering, both for Tim and Dulani, have you done any looking or poking around at what happens when a subject matter expert in whatever field you're querying does this task versus a non-expert?
Todd, what do you mean by that? Like,
well,
let me describe a little bit more about the interface is, in theory, only supposed to quote what you've given it. So if you've given it a bunch of subject matter papers, it's only supposed to respond from those papers. I've been told, I haven't yet seen it, I've been told that it's still possible for the tool to hallucinate in this, but it gives a nice output where it shows you, and it'll go through, give it a million pages, it'll give you 10 paragraphs that are the best fit, and then it'll summarize those paragraphs in an answer to your question. So you can see pretty quickly the pure text that it pulled, and then whether it's summarized them well. So you can look it over. When you ask the expert question, it makes me think you're wondering whether it's hallucinating outside of the papers you gave it.
No. Well, so, okay, your clarification makes me fork my question. So in the one case, I guess, can you use a large language model to come up with the papers that you're going to feed it, right? So I'm trying to figure out, does subject matter expertise matter anymore, given that, in this process? Because presumably, in what you're talking about, you'd want the subject matter expertise in determining what the input sources were. And then I can imagine a subject matter expert who then is looking at the outputs and doing some analysis of that.
Yeah, I mean, I would say there's some, it's working at I don't know, basically what is written kind of level and natural language understanding. I would say that any of the fountain, like if you're, I don't know, pick an example of, I don't have any good examples, but there are a lot of higher level ways we approach knowledge synthesis that I would not expect this to be able to accomplish. It's really just reformulating what's written. It's, well, I mean, I've seen some tools, like the classic thing is, what happens if you touch an iron? And if it's written somewhere, then of course the tool can find it. But if it doesn't know, like let's find something that it doesn't know that you can be burned by that. Those are the kinds of, I don't know, common sense, I guess, questions that it's just not going to be able to answer if it doesn't know anything about the characteristics of something like that. So I'd say it's very good at answering questions on large bodies of text if you're just trying to find what you know is already answered. But if you're trying to do any kind of knowledge synthesis, I think that's where an expert's existing, I'll use the word education since I asked the question earlier, an expert's existing education, background knowledge, and contextual understanding becomes very important.
Got it. Zara.
Yeah, I just wanted to add, because you mentioned SMEs. They actually came across one of a platform that uses the GPT for I think model as the underlying thing, but you could actually simulate an expert. So you just go, I think it's called expert or something, but you could go there and like, I want to talk to maybe an expert in this, and then you could have a conversation about that. So yeah, FYI, it exists.
So Tim, what's surprised you so far?
I think the big surprise has been how well the embeddings seem to do at recognizing related material. I just pasted into the chat an example of what we're getting back. So I ask a question like, what is the role of UAVs in the battlefield? Something that Rand has published a lot on lately, because we only have fairly recent stuff. So not every question produces enough stuff to be useful. And it finds, seven papers and a number of references in some of those papers, and comes up with stuff that isn't just narrowly addressing that question. It comes up with stuff that's relevant to that question, and does a better job of coming up with stuff that's relevant to that question than I would have expected. This isn't old brittle AI where it's just looking for, those words. It really is looking for related ideas, and something that I can't say systematically exactly how well it's doing, but I think a surprise has been how rich the bucket of stuff is that comes back. The workflow, very briefly, we've taken the RAND corpus, chopped it up into kind of page-sized chunks, sent each of those off to OpenAI API to get an embedding, which is a 1,500 element vector that locates that piece of text in semantic space. And then put those in a vector database. You then ask a question, we get an embedding for that, query the database, and get the 10 things that are closest to it. And then provide those as context and have ChatGPT or GPT 3.5 Turbo write something using the things it fished out of the database as context, referring only to information in the context and citing the context. That's basically what it's doing, and that works better than you'd think. The embeddings seem to be quite good.
Cool. Mo.
I think there are a few individuals ahead of me. Keller, I think he raised his hand before me.
Oh, I think Keller still had his up, but
Oh, okay.
Yeah, sorry, that was left over. You go.
Yeah.
Oh, no problem. And I realize that ChatGPT is smart in a way that it depends the level of conversation that you have with it. So if you have like you ask simple questions, it knows like who he is dealing with or she is dealing with. But and that's like a baseline for it. So if you don't add it like in prompts, for example, if you, and it knows through prompts. So it seems to me like that, because I had this conversation back and forth and realized it's not just a machine. Simply, it knows like at what level this question is, and then somehow responds based on that. Like it has a history of you sometimes, like in a thread itself. And I ask a question like, when I have a thread, at the end of thread, I say who I am based on this thread. Explain who I am. You saw this thread of we had these so many questions back and forth. Now tell me who I am based on this thread. So and you when you ask that question, you get a sense of basically that this machine is not just a machine. It knows about you, and at the level of that you converse with it, like it adjusts itself to you as an individual. And so that's something which I was surprised.
It sounds like Amazon purchase recommendation on steroids. Bill, you want to ask your question for Tim and Delani?
Okay, I forgive if this has already been said, but are you guys using LangChain and PaperQA for Ask Rand?
Yes, we're jumping off from there. We've been modifying a lot, but that's definitely where we started.
Okay, and I mean, I presume if other people at Rand want to try and use your code rather than reinventing the wheel, we could possibly do that.
Yeah, at this point, Liang is the technical dude on this, and we're trying to get that expertise a little more widely spread throughout the team. But at this point, Liang is the guy who controls that. But yes, absolutely,
Cool.
it's not proprietary for us at all. We're trying to get this adopted, not trying to control it.
And
really exciting.
And Bill, I just continue to, I forked the Hugging Face space, and I just upload papers when I feel like it, run them, and then turn it off again. Like I'm not using Ask Rand. I throw what I want in the existing Hugging Face space, use it, and then walk away again. Which is another way to do it. It's quick.
And Delani, yeah, there's it still can't draw hands. So
well, I mean the new image tools do a great job, but you know what I'm referring to, right, Todd? Like,
yeah,
there's little corners in here that we just don't, that it's not going to get right, and we're not going to know.
And you know what's interesting is that, and maybe this is the one thing that humans still do well, is we have a lot easier time picking up all of the hallucinations on images than we have in text, I think.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think it's just a function of the way embeddings work in our brains and in these tools, right? So they're doing a very broad, we might have a very broad image of what a human is, but we have very detailed information in certain locations, and it has roughly an equivalent level of detail depending on what it's been fed on everything. And so it's really an embeddings problem, I guess, or a architectural problem. I don't know.
Well, yeah, but and that said, when I saw the demo of Viper GPT, I was shocked.
That's mind-blowing.
For those that yeah, I encourage those who don't know what Viper GPT is. It's out of Columbia University, and basically the algorithm combines computer vision and a large language model, and you give it an image of 2 children and 8 muffins, and you give it a text query of what's the fairest distribution of muffins, and the algorithm says 4 each. So it's understanding the concept of fairness. It's using computer vision. It understands sort of. I was shocked at how good it was at that. So we're coming up towards the top of the hour, but since Bill is here, Bill and I had a quick email exchange, and so I think we've talked sort of broadly about some of the education aspects of this and guidances and whatnot. But I think Bill, in his last salvo back to me, was said that he's very vexed by assessment and how you do assessment in this sort of world. So I guess one thing is using the tool itself to do assessment of student work. But then, Bill, do you want to say a little bit more about the other angles of assessment that give you heartburn?
Yeah, I mean, what I'm struggling with is, one, I don't want to be a survey, or punish. Like, I don't try to catch students using GPT and punish them. I also don't want them to not learn. So there's got to be a way to have them learn to do things that are value in a world that I presume will involve ubiquitous AI, but not have them sort of shortcut. And like, I already knew years ago, I don't want to do like, short answer questions and memorize stuff. But, if embeddings allow you to plausibly and almost instantly create something that sounds, sort of like, plausible for a knowledge summarization task, then what do we assess? What do we teach? And what do we assess that is above knowledge summarization and as a value? And, like audience analysis, did you make these slides for the right audience? Are there ways to have like things that are very disparate conceptually that are synthetic? I don't know. And like, man, if anyone's any ideas, I want to hear them, because like I'm struggling.
So I can give you one example from my distant past when I was a chemistry professor, and I don't know if it's how generalizable it is or whether it's a unicorn or not. So I always gave open book exams and I gave unlimited time exams, which students should be fearful of. But that was sort of anyway, in biochemistry, I always gave them a problem where I said, imagine an enzyme that catalyzes this reaction, and I gave them the chemical reaction. Describe the active site. Now, it's an enzyme that doesn't exist in the real world, so a large language model would not know it because it doesn't exist. And what I taught them as a lead up to that was I taught them known enzyme structure function relationships, and then talked about how they work and why they work. And then that led me to a knowledge synthesis question, which is, okay, imagine a world where this is the thing. What does this look like? I would imagine that language models are going to be able to do that at some point. But for now, they can't, as far as I can tell. Any other thoughts in the last couple minutes here? What if you were talking to a K through 12 teacher, or you were talking to a university professor? What would you tell them? What would be your guidance?
I do feel like the role is very different between those two.
Yep.
K-12, like for instance, letting in the old calculator debate that was a thing when I was a kid. When you haven't learned your multiplication tables yet, a calculator is actually a dangerous thing. You really do want to have those memorized, and they're a pain to memorize. I was bad at that. Once I had them memorized, then I didn't need to know them anymore, because calculator, I don't multiply much stuff in my head anymore. I do it all with Excel or with a calculator. So I feel like in primary school, you're teaching kids how to organize thoughts, how to write. I'm inclined for graduate school to say, if you haven't learned to write yet, I'm not actually here to teach you to write. I'm here to teach you how to find the right ideas, present them compellingly, not say stuff that's made up and wrong. And so I feel like these tools are a lot more useful in graduate school. And people are still, boy, if you turn in a hallucinated citation, I'm going to be really unhappy with you. On the other hand, I would like to be able to read what you're thinking. Like if your language is clear enough that I can see what you're saying, that would be great.
Dulani.
In response to that last comment, I would say that I used to collect quotes, and one of them was, education is what you have after you've forgotten all the facts you've learned. And so, you know, these tools, yeah, I mean, these tools are full of facts, but they've also learned some things too. They have some reasoning ability right now, at least. So anyway, that's sort of my thought about the calculator and what you've learned. But I guess this isn't really what you'd say to a K through 12 teacher, but I do think that someone needs to do a really deep dive into how the various technologies over the years have changed what we've taught, and how that should shape what we're thinking in the future. So spell check, calculators, all of the above, you know, they changed the way we were taught, and I think we should just be looking at how those past changes and will I guess potentially inform the future and how we should change.
You know, so I'm in violent agreement, Dulani, but I would argue that to me, it's not clear that spell check and calculators actually did do a deep dive into what we teach and how we teach it. I think there were knee-jerk reactions and there was some movement, but I don't know that there was a fundamental rethink of what we teach, how we teach it, and why we're actually teaching those things. I think that this is going to force that conversation.
Yeah, that's fair. It's definitely not my field, but my undergrad is in engineering, and I was at the stage where they taught us to do a whole bunch of stuff with books, and then showed us, okay, here's the computer that can do the same thing. And I don't really, again, that's just my perspective on it. I don't know in a broad way how it's affected the theory of pedagogy, or however you would put it. It's not my field, but I do think it's worth looking at. You may be right, Todd. Maybe there's nothing there, but I think it's worth looking at.
Well, I think there's stuff there, but I think that it was, we just kind of, you know, education oftentimes is just it's in reactive mode because you never have time to really do substantial deep dives into things. And yeah, that's a whole other long conversation. I can say the one particular about the calculator debate was, and we saw this teaching chemistry, especially intro chem, which is basically a math course. The big problem that we always saw was if a student wasn't good at doing math without a calculator, they had no idea about orders of magnitude, and they never knew if the calculator was if the answer was complete nonsense, right? And so the whole idea, and this is why slide rules were actually useful, because they taught you about orders of magnitude. And so we had a lot of discussions about, because I was a student during I had an HP 15C, so I could program it to do linear regressions. And but there was this whole argument about having to understand conceptually what's going on with orders of magnitude. And so I come back to this, well, then doing the mechanical times tables in K through 12 lead you to that place where you can now begin to understand that? Or can you just go from zero to hero and somehow understand orders of magnitude a different way without having to do that? And I think that's the conversation we haven't had yet.
Yeah, sounds good to me.
They don't teach penmanship anymore. I mean, they teach keyboarding instead of penmanship, which is, as a dyslexic, I'm all for that, because penmanship was going to be a disaster for me no matter what.
As someone who's left-handed, when you're left-handed, you drag your hand across what you've just written. So when you write with a pen, you generally smear everything that you write. So I'm with you there. All right, we're over time. Thanks, everyone. This has been great. I've been taking some notes. We'll pop this up on our YouTube channel, and this will be an ongoing conversation, because there's a lot of deep questions that need to get asked here, and RAND's just the place to do it. So, good deal.